So we've read and heard many stories about migrants, both documented and undocumented, as well as refugees in Malaysia, their struggles and constant fear to survive after escaping from their home country, seeking for a better future. So when COVID-19 struck in February 2020, the government ordered a movement control order, and some would say a lockdown to contain the pandemic. So documented and undocumented migrants, refugees are fearful during the lockdown, fear of coming out to get checked and screened for virus, but later detained by the immigration department, by the authorities. Their fear is real, and true enough, during the enhanced MCO, hundreds of migrants were rounded up at various markets and sent to detention centres. Some of them tried to flee from the authorities and escape from being detained, sent back to the countries. So in April, more than 30 Rohingya refugees died in a boat en route to Malaysia from Myanmar. They were stranded in the sea for 4 months. More than 300 of them were rescued from the sea. They were turned away by Malaysian authorities. So this week on BMI, Bicara Minggu Ini, on the next episode of the special series on Malaysian Women in Journalism, and I'm your host, Norman Goh. Our next guest will share on his program about migrants and refugees in Malaysia. And the elephant in the room is, do we have slavery in Malaysia? Is this neo-slavery? She has been an investigative journalist for about 2 decades and an independent filmmaker of at least a dozen films. She has covered stories from armed smugglers, militants in the southern Thailand and Indonesia, refugees in Myanmar, baby traffickers, and even the Tamil Tiger separatist rebel group in Sri Lanka. Here in Malaysia, she has been covering many stories about migrants and refugees living in the country. Speaking to Bicara Minggu Ini, we have Mahi Ramakrishnan, an independent filmmaker and investigative journalist. Welcome, Mahi.
Hello.
Hello. So how's it been? I mean, one of the things that you were busy on currently is the Refugee Fest. There were a lot of obstacles going on. So we will come to that, that sort of stories. But tell us, from your side, how has it been as a journalist for the past 2 decades?
How has it been? I think that, I went into journalism and started exploring at the most opportune moment because, unlike now, where journalism, it's not really more traditional. Everything is done online, and I feel that the oomph isn't quite there. But, at that point in time, there was a need for journalists and journalists who actually worked on the ground. It was more traditional. The newspapers were all thriving. The magazines were thriving. And I started off with the Sun newspaper, actually. And then I worked a little bit under Stephen Gunn Special Issues, and he was a mentor of sorts. And then after that, I did a bit of work with AP and a little bit of work with Malaysia Kini, AFP. And after that, I went to Time Magazine. And I must say, from there was no looking back, because my bosses in Time Magazine were incredible. They allowed me the space to actually explore and to do my own stories. So when I was working for Time Magazine, I started exploring stories on Islamic militancy, Southeast Asia. Now, the good thing is that instead of expecting me to kind of like check in and check out 9 o'clock to 5 o'clock or whatever time, even though my bosses are all in Hong Kong, they actually gave me the freedom to go, make contacts, talk to people, establish relationships, which are incredibly important things that one has to do if you want to be a good investigative journalist. Because you need to know everyone, you need to know a cabinet minister, but you also need to know a smuggler, because you do so many stories, right? So I must say that Time Magazine was the one that was the stepping stone, because they allowed me the freedom and the kind of circumstances that allowed me to actually become an investigative journalist. So it was just me trying to figure out what to do, how to do things, and then it was a huge learning curve.
What made you that when you were working with Stephen, Stephen was also doing some of the stories. I remember when he went to Timor, and he was to a point that he was detained in Timor when he covered stories like that. So what were the turning point when you want to do this genre stories. Not many people will have the courage to delve deeper into investigative journalism. It comes in many ways, but your stories are not easy. They were very, very challenging. So, what were the turning point at the time when you first started that made that you say, because you got to tell yourself that this is the one thing that I really want to pursue?
Starting off in a newsroom is important because it kind of equips you with the skills that's necessary. It allows you to meet so many different people because you're sent out on assignments almost on a daily basis. So you need to establish that relationship and that contact. After that, you get bored. You don't just
Even now, I started to get pretty bored with politics because A and B speaks to C speaks to A. So it's like, it never gets on because at the end of the day, it's just, again, the big topic today, we talk about Malaysian women in journalism. Politics is just men just rushing to, they're just looking for power. Things like that. One of the reasons why I wanted to I started this series is that I see there's so much contribution from women journalists, especially in this field. Your stories were very compelling. People were hitting you, so why you write stories about refugees and migrants? There are more stories about Malaysians. Yeah, but actual fact is, migrants and refugees lived among us. So, back, when I listen to your stories about yourself when you first started as a journalist, what do you remember most about when you first started writing stories about migrants and refugees?
Let me tell you something else. Before that,
Yes.
what I remember most about being a journalist, first day at work, I was sent by this person in Sun newsroom to actually cover a conference which was happening in University Malaya. I had no idea how to cover it. I didn't even know that you need to look for that one peg that you can use. So I was thinking, so many people here and they keep on talking. What am I going to do now? So I went back to the office and I wrote something, right? And then I sent it to the editor. And I waited and waited and waited. I was really scared. And then after a few hours, he actually calls me. And this is what he did. He printed it out. He looked at me and he just like crushed it into a ball and looked at me and just like threw it into the dustbin. And I was standing there looking at myself like, do you really need this? And then I asked myself, do you really want to do this? Is this for you? But then, I kind of persevered, right? So when you start telling stories, you understand that, initially you think that you're going to change the world. 2-3 years into journalism, I realized, oh my God, I'm not going to change anything. But then you realize that, your stories are important because you're making information available out there. And people make decisions based on information that's available out there. So a few years into journalism, realized that my biggest role was to ensure that the information that I put out there as a journalist is accurate, has been verified, and fact-checked. And I think that's really important. So, when you realize that your stories actually go a long way in, can I say, being the voice for the voiceless? I just find it too elitist. But, when stories that people cannot tell themselves because they do not have the avenue to do so, but you are able to do that, whether it's through a magazine, through a newspaper, or through your films, then you think that, okay, I am doing something.
So it's, kind of reminded me of the things I picked up when I first started at Kini. I remember nobody could make it to one of the kampongs. I think it was, I can't remember, I was in Kampong Pandan. And none of the journalists were free to go. And then I asked Stephen, can I go? One thing that struck me is that, when you mention giving the voice to the voiceless, it's also giving the human to the invisible people in the streets. So I think, sometimes I do question some of my friends is that what we as journalists are doing right now, what role do we play? So when we come to migrants and refugees over the past few months, I think this is not new. Seeing how Malaysians respond to Rohingyas, I couldn't stomach in some of the comments were made about refugees in the country, to a point that they were so much dehumanized in the online space. Despite, there's so many stories, and unfortunately they're being used as a political tool. So what do you say about that?
You know, what we have seen over the last few months, 3 months from the start of the MCO is really unprecedented. Because it is so well coordinated, it's so well planned, and it's so shocking. But more than the narrative itself, what was even more shocking and sad for me was to see the kind of response from Malaysians on the ground. It kind of made me question again and again as to what kind of a society we have become. But more than that, I wished and wished and wished that the newspapers, the journalists and reporters will actually go the extra mile to humanize the people that they were talking about. It really irks me until today when I read the word illegal documents, illegal migrant workers, for example, as opposed to undocumented migrant workers. I don't understand why it's so difficult for papers to actually say, or news media to actually say, undocumented migrant workers. But I also realized that when I was a journalist, I had to keep pushing the boundary. I had to just keep pushing and pushing and pushing. And I'm not sure because, I don't really have that very many friends in the local media, and I don't really talk to anyone on a daily basis. So I don't quite understand the constraints and the restrictions that's placed on them by the editors in chief and, people who are the decision makers in media organizations. But I do wish that, beyond the call of duty, that they will actually try to humanize stories, to actually, instead of just saying this many people were arrested, but to actually give it more context. The fact that, seeking refuge is an inherent human right. So why are they being arrested? But we don't hear these things. And that is why largely when you go and speak to Malaysians, they may not really understand issues and its complexities on a wholesome basis. And it could also be because we are not giving them the entire information when we write our stories and news reports.
It's the same
I mean, I
when,
did wrong, but
yeah, I remember when Tashni was investigated by the authorities for tweeting, as well on her coverage during the running up, when they run up migrant workers and refugees at the markets. Sometimes when I read reports, it became too dry. Sometimes I do ask a question about why stories like that. They do not tell stories about how the migrant workers, whether they're documented or undocumented, what are we doing as journalists? Are we just going out there and report, but we are not telling, what is important to the public? Again, the biggest question that I wanted to ask you is, when we have so many human trafficking stories, whether there's baby trafficking and all that, Malaysia has become a transit for a lot of human trafficking. I remember my former colleague wrote about Alia Al-Hajri. She wrote a story about the human trafficking in Klang at the Bird's Nest factory. And recently we've seen immigration officers were arrested for their involvement in human trafficking. So is neo-slavery a thing now in Malaysia?
I'm not sure whether it's a thing now, but the thing is, we have heard, over the last few years about immigration officers being arrested for human trafficking, for actually, if I remember rightly, selling bonded fishermen, selling migrants to the bonded, to the fishing trade as bonded slavery, as bonded slaves. Sorry. So the thing is that it's not that it is not happening. It's just been happening for far too long, I must say. I remember 2 or 3 years ago when I was working on a story called Bo, which is the trafficking of young Rohingya girls who are then sold off as child brides to Rohingya men. One of the interviews I did was with a trafficker, and he actually said that his colleagues in Bangladesh actually prepare new passports, forge them, and then fly these kids into Malaysia via Kuala Lumpur International Airport, and then they are sold off for, I don't know, something like 18,000 or 16,000 Malaysian ringgit. So when that film came out, there was a lot of pressure on me because, of course, the police were not happy. The government wasn't happy. But I remember distinctly that 6 weeks later, more than 100 immigration officers were transferred out of Kuala Lumpur International Airport. So what I'm trying to say is that there are some of us out there who still believe that, digging up the truth is important, putting that information out there is important. So instead of the kind of harassment that we see against media, whether it's Tashni or Stephen Gunn of Malaysia Kini, instead of doing that, instead of harassing media workers, instead of trying to silence us, it will be incredible if people, enforcement authorities, the government can actually work together, because we actually do a lot of dangerous work out there, don't we?
Yeah, I mean, even your stories, going undercover, covering stories on brothels and all that, it's a sacrifice, and journalists can be of the help of the authorities. I don't understand why authorities are scared of journalists. Journalists can tell you, speaking the truth. They can be an ally when it comes to this sort of unfortunate things going around us. So moving forward, when how are we going to move forward in this line of covering of stories on migrants and refugees, in your opinion?
We really have to be bold and courageous. We really need to humanize stories. So instead of saying so many migrant workers were actually detained, I actually am quite happy if you don't have photos of migrant women or refugee women and men or older people and children in chains. I mean, you can just say it. You can say that, or you can write it, saying that they were arrested and they were handcuffed or they were chained. We don't really have to see that. I mean, it's just so much humiliation. I mean, why are we humiliating these people, the most vulnerable, over and over and over? Not just dehumanizing them, but having photos of it splashed all over and then shared widely. And I think that every reporter has to understand that he or she has this responsibility, because like I keep saying, we are sharing information out there, and we really need to get our facts right. We need to give it context. Giving context is not just giving 8 paragraphs of the minister said this or the immigration officer said this, these people were arrested, but the why, how, when did this happen, and why is it a violation? I mean, it's just so easy. Just do a little bit of Googling, do a little bit of research. Maybe, like I said, it's difficult because of the restraints and the constraints, and I do understand that. But I also believe that if all of us come together and keep pushing the limits, keep pushing our boundary, and keep saying to our editor that no, we need to stand up for this group of people, things will change. I mean, you need to believe that things will change. If not, why are we doing this?
Yeah, no, not many journalists like you too. I think I would really love to see more and more Mahi coming up. I'm also intrigued on how, when you write stories, you report stories, you have done films as well. How do you come to that part of making films, into visual storytelling? It's not easy because even getting some of my friends, those who are journalists, to come on my program to speak, they said, "Sorry, I'm just too shy to speak and I don't know how to speak." But I did tell them, if journalists don't tell their stories, and people don't know who are those who have been working very hard to tell compelling stories of those without voices, these are the people who should be celebrated, like you, because you give voice to a lot of people. So in your part, when you do your films, was it very difficult? Was it really hard for you when you first started?
Writing a news report is different. Writing for a magazine like Time magazine is totally different. And films, because when you use visuals, it's, oh my God, that much more difficult, because people talk to you, right? They will talk to you and everything is okay, and then you go back and you put a camera in front of them and the person freezes, like, oops.
Yes.
And then you're like, oh, this is not going to happen today. So the whole thing is to win their trust, is to earn their trust, is for them to believe that that story is told with the right motivation. It's not just about seeking limelight for yourself or just sensationalizing something. It's really about believing and having the confidence that telling that story will bring about some change. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next year, but it will. So it's incredibly difficult, because visuals, when you ask people to start speaking into a camera, they freeze. But having said that, when you read something or when you listen to an audio, yes, you are intrigued, but when you actually watch a film, because it's moving visuals, it's that much more intriguing. And it has got a wider reach. And I realized that, okay, if I want to tell stories of people, then I will put them on the screen. But Norman, when you
Mm.
do things like that, especially when you work on very difficult stories like baby trafficking and migrant trafficking and, you know, young Rohingya girls who have been repeatedly raped. Like one girl told me that she was raped by more than 60 traffickers. When you do those things, even though, yes, you know, you make sure that you can't see their faces, but the thing is, they are human and they are there. And then you go back home and you ask yourself, what have I done? You know, have I done the right thing? You know, what is actually happening here? What if I can't see something happening? You know, then, you know, even though you tell yourself change comes, you know, it will come, but then you are like, no, it has to happen now, it has to happen tomorrow. Because, you know, how do I justify the fact that these people have actually stood naked and told the entire world their story and what has happened on the ground in terms of change? You don't really see it, do you? So sometimes it gets that much more difficult. I haven't really done a film after Bo because listening to these young kids was very traumatizing. So I just want journalists and filmmakers to know that, you know, they don't have to be a Mahi because they are all better than Mahi. They can be better than Mahi, way better. I believe in that. People tell their stories differently. Just because you don't do a story on militancy or trafficking, it doesn't mean you're not a good storyteller or you're not a good filmmaker or a reporter. Each and every story is different. Each and every story is important. This you need to know. So, you know, I'm the person who had to think standing in the Sun newsroom whether or not I wanted to be a journalist, because my first story went into the rubbish bin right before my eyes. But having said that, I have also personally really suffered when it comes to mental health issues, and I would like to be open about it here because I was diagnosed last year with depression and PTSD and also bipolar. So, you know, it's not easy because when you listen to people talking about their issues, you cannot not get affected. I know the first thing they teach you in journalism is that, look, the story is there, you are here, maintain the distance. It doesn't really work that way. You do get affected. And sometimes, maybe because you are emotional, you are crying and you have got all kinds of issues, maybe because you're human, that the story is important, that you're able to bring all of that element into the story that you're telling, and that's equally important as well. So again, to reporters out there, if you have any of these mental health issues, then there's nothing for you to be ashamed of. Yes, seek out, of course, but you know, it's understandable. You're human, and that's beautiful.
When thanks for sharing on your personal stuff when it comes to mental health as well. I think most of us do face a lot of challenges when it comes to mental health. This reminds me of an author, a researcher, the one who wrote the Nanjing massacre. You know,
Yeah.
it really took a toll on her. But without her revelation, we would not know what happened. And stories like just like journalists like you know, uncovering stories like that, because it really had a lot of impact on a lot of journalists like all of us here, because we're all human after all. You know, when stories like that, it is so emotional. It will impact on all of us. And you know, when it comes to what happened here in Malaysia to Refugee Fest, I was looking forward to it. And then when I read the report saying that a lot of them had to pull out because they were scared, there was a lot of fear. What now? What will happen next?
The thing is that the refugee festival is happening. It started yesterday, but it's unfortunate that refugees themselves, you know, artists from different refugee communities, felt that, you know, maybe it's not the right time for them to actually speak on panels or even perform. But we still have a few performances. But you know, people who have watched the refugee festival over the last 4 years will know that 80 to 90% of the performances are by the refugees themselves, and they sit in each and every panel. Sometimes the entire panel is you know, refugee speakers themselves and moderated by a refugee as well. Because you know, I wear many hats, and I also run a non-profit organization called Beyond Borders. And I do believe that instead of me speaking for and on behalf of the refugees, it's important for them to be able to articulate their aspirations and that's really important for us to create platforms and opportunities and chances for them to be able to do that effectively. So that's one of the reasons why the Refugee Festival came about. So yes, sometimes you ask yourself, oh my God, after 5 years, is this a failure? But the thing is, things take time to change on the ground. Now I have a choice. I can sit at home and say, look at these Malaysians, they're really cribbing and complaining, and there's so much hate speech, and it's so toxic, and I can go on and on like this and have conversations like this over tea and coffee and dinner and whatever. Or I can say, okay, listen, Mahi, you still have the platform and you can do something using it. And that is exactly what we are doing. Both Saleh, the co-director, and myself, Saleh Sepas, the Afghan theatre director, and myself, we are co-directing the festival this year. So we decided that the festival itself is important. The festival itself is a platform that can actually talk about the fact that refugees had to pull out. And that statement is equally important, because then we are telling the authorities that things are really going badly on the ground. So please, do send a strong message to Malaysians saying that, yes, you have a government policy, but the bullying, the hate speech, the xenophobia is just not on.
Yeah, this is sometimes when we complain or we pointed out some of the horrible comments, I think the next thing what we all can do as journalists is to start educating the public and humanizing the images of migrant workers and refugees. Even today, I was quite surprised that Bernama came out with a story about the migrant workers in PJ Market was wondering how are they going to survive after this. It is very, I wouldn't say very elaborate. It was just very simple how they make money and things like that. It was very descriptive. Very simple story, but I think it is good. What would you say, to sum up our discussion today? What would you say to a lot of journalists out there when you cover on stories on migrant workers as well as refugees? What would you say to them?
The thing is, media has changed a lot. This, right? It has really changed from a very traditional form to something that is kind of much more complex, but yes, simple. It's complex, it's simple, it's not traditional. It allows people to kind of come up with stories and put their stories out there. So everything has changed. And it has also been incredible, because I know that there are many reporters out there who are also on my Facebook. So if you really feel that you cannot tell your stories, you cannot tell your stories and because that your editor isn't going to allow it to be published, then brilliant. Then fine, look for other avenues, because you have your Facebook, you have your Instagram, you have your Twitter, and what have you not? You have blogs and whatever else. So use those platforms to tell the story, right? If you have to write 8 paragraphs about this many people were arrested at whatever time and whatever place, and now they are in whichever immigration detention center, and this is what the immigration DG or director, whoever it is, said. And then, as a follow-up, you also have a particular minister saying this. So that's your story. That's the only thing that the media is that your newspaper is going to allow you to publish. Fine, then find other avenues. But do you want to find the other avenues? Do you really believe that your stories are important? Do you really believe that that story that you're going to write on your personal space that can be shared by many, many thousand people, whether you believe or not, that's important. And that story needs to be told. Now, this is important. If a person doesn't believe in it, it's not going to happen. So I urge everyone to first understand that they are powerful, that because they can tell stories, powerful stories that can change people's lives, that can bring about new policies that is going to be positive towards someone's progression, someone's life. And, you have an opportunity to play this role. You have an opportunity to facilitate this change, to facilitate new conversations and narratives. So please use that.
Thank you so much, Mahi. And that's it. And this is a very good way to end today's special episode on Malaysian women in journalism. And thank you so much for sharing your story, Mahi. And I know it's very it's raining heavily outside. And listen to the full podcast of Bicara Minggu Ini on Spotify, Anchor, and Google Podcasts. Follow me on Twitter at I'mKnownGo for the latest updates on current affairs and stories.